All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to our C. Edwin Baker for 2023, the C. Edwin Baker Lecture for Liberty, Equality, and Democracy. And we're very happy to have the support of the C. Edwin Baker family, who've established this lecture to honor the legacy of the late C. Edwin Baker, who had been the Nicholas F. Gallicchio Professor of Law and Communication at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. WVU College of Law would like to thank the Baker family for their generosity in supporting this lecture and allow us to house the collected works of C. Edwin Baker in the George R. Farmer Jr. Library. C. Edwin Baker, who was born in 1947 and passed away in 2009, again, was at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he was a leading scholar of constitutional law, communication law, and free speech. He was considered one of the country's foremost authorities on the First Amendment and on mass media policy. Now I'll have Professor LaFasso come up and introduce our speaker for the day, and continue enjoying your black bear. Sorry, it's a little crunchy.
Thank you, Dean Reinhardt. I want to start with on a personal note. Michelle and I attended law school together with her husband, Dan, who's here today. We were all in the same first-year section. And as you know, my co-director in the Supreme Court Clinic, Larry Rosenberg, is also here today, and he was a year behind us in law school. We all had Ed Baker. And Ed Baker had a profound influence on all of us, which is why his family endowed a lecture series here at WVU. Michelle and Dan and me were just 1Ls, like many of you. We were 2Ls, we were 3Ls, and we didn't know what our career was going to be. And we had Ed Baker. And then, and Ed was very inspirational. And I'm going to tell you what he did for Michelle, but first I'm going to tell you how Michelle and Dan, they met in the class, first year. Then they decided to date. As I always tease Dan, he somehow gave some poison to Michelle, and it wore off after they got married, so there was nothing that she could do about it anymore. So he really was able to. I'm flubbing this comedy thing very badly, but anyway. But in all seriousness, I remember the day they decided that they were going to forge a life together, and we were in the Goat, which is our lobby. It was called the Goat because there was a goat in the middle, a statue of a goat. Anyway, it's a long story, okay? And Michelle and Dan were just hugging. So I said to our mutual friend, Aaron Krause, who happens to be Larry Rosenberg's best friend, I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Oh, Dan and Michelle decided to move to DC together after law school." Dan has been with the United States government the entire time. How many years are we out of law school now? 30-something? 32? He is currently the Chief Counsel for Development and Innovation at the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection, where he basically does a lot of policy. For example, right to repair, and he advises leadership on AI policies. That's pretty impressive. Now let me tell you about Michelle. And I hope this inspires you, that you all can be whatever you want to be. Michelle is an attorney with over 3 decades of experience representing media, technology, and nonprofit organizations. She has expertise in structuring, negotiating, and drafting complex commercial agreements, content licensing, nonprofit governance, digital privacy, technology law, copyright law, communications law, and the broad variety of legal issues arising in a media organization. Michelle worked for more than 25 years as an attorney for National Public Radio, retiring in 2022 as Deputy General Counsel and Assistant Corporate Secretary, as well as Secretary to the NPR Foundation Board of Trustees. She served as Acting Chief Legal Officer, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of NPR from November 20th to February 2021. So just think about it. She was the interim general counsel between November 2020 and February 2021. So think of the news cycle during that time. That's the election, that's January 6th, and that's the aftermath of January 6th, not to mention other things. Recently, she accepted a position as general counsel of America's Public Television Stations, a nonprofit membership organization that ensures a strong and financially sound public television system and helps its member stations provide essential public services in education, public safety, and civic leadership. So in other words, every PBS is a member of this. So she's the general counsel of this trade association of every PBS, every public television station in the country. Michelle has in the past been an associate in the communications group at the law firm of Hogan Hartson, which is now called HoganLovells, representing broadcasters, cable operators, satellite providers, and other communication companies. She began her career as an associate at the communications law firm of Cohn Marks in Washington, D.C. Michelle received her bachelor's, magna cum laude, from Villanova, where she was a member of the Phi Beta Kappa, and her law degree, cum laude, from the University of Pennsylvania. Please help me give a warm West Virginia welcome to Michelle Shanahan.
Wow, well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Dean Reinhardt, and thanks for the warm welcome. It's really an honor and a delight to be here. And I also want to give a special thanks to my friend and law school classmate, Ann LaFaso, for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak with you today. Professor LaFaso was one of those people who added so much to our law school experience. She was kind, she was funny, and she always raised these tough and interesting questions that made her fellow students and her professors really think more rigorously and look at things from unique perspectives. And I suspect that describes her as a law professor today. She's such a dynamo, and I really so admire all she does for her students and her community and workers' rights in the legal world. So thank you. And I was especially touched when Professor LaFaso asked me to deliver a talk in this lecture series established in honor of our wonderful and brilliant professor, C. Edwin Baker. Professor Baker had a really profound impact on my career path in ways I'm really continuing to discover to this day. So being asked to deliver this lecture is particularly meaningful to me. When I went to law school at the age of 22, I knew I enjoyed reading and writing and public policy, but I have to admit I really didn't know how a lawyer spent their day, and I definitely didn't know how I was going to use my degree. So I first met Professor Baker as a 1L, as Ann mentioned, when he was my constitutional law professor. And he spent a lot of that time on the First Amendment. And as someone who had been a college newspaper writer and editor and an avid reader of the news, I was really enthralled. I went on to take 2 more classes with Professor Baker, a mass media and communications law class and then a communications law seminar, both with Ann. And by the end of law school, thanks in large part to those classes, I realized I could carve out a really interesting and satisfying legal career that combined my interests in law, journalism, and the media. And I saw that there were many ways to do that, whether it was as an academic like Professor Baker, as a litigator, which I didn't really think was my cup of tea, or in ways that were more suited to my sort of practical, service-oriented nature, including as a business, content, and regulatory attorney, or a combination of the 3 in my case. And I also learned from Professor Baker a less tangible, but even more important lesson, that someone could be an outstanding lawyer and a scholar, and also a really kind and thoughtful person. And they could be soft-spoken while also being a persistent and effective advocate. And those Those are lessons that don't change with the case law or the legislation or the regulations. So before I get started on the meat of my topic today, as the business and content lawyer that I am, I'm going to start with a little disclaimer. The views I express here today are my own, and they are not those of my past employers, my new employer, or the clients that I have served. So the topic of my discussion up here is why media ownership matters, a case for local nonprofit media. And as Professor Baker taught, media ownership matters a lot, including in the kind and quantity of service that is provided by a media outlet. And when there's less local ownership of the media, there's typically less coverage of state and city government, less coverage of the local school boards and local arts events, and local businesses and institutions. And without that local coverage and local information, there tends to be less engagement in the local community, and less connection among neighbors. And that really, makes our democracy suffer as a result. A 2021 study that was called the Belonging Barometer, prepared by the American Immigration Council, they found that 74% of Americans reported non-belonging in their local community. And that's a big problem. And it's one that local media can help remedy. There are so many indicators today suggesting that local media is at a crisis point. And I will argue that we need to support local media, and we especially need to support local nonprofit media organizations because they're so well suited from a legal and structural standpoint to engage in local journalism that educates citizens, increases civic engagement, and helps heal some of the fractures in our democracy that we're seeing. So as I started to work on this lecture, I thought it would be helpful to begin with a grounding in Professor Baker's extensive scholarship in the free speech, freedom of the press, and the economics of the mass media. This was a bit of a big undertaking because, as you can see from the photo here, he was quite a prolific writer. So Professor Baker, who's often recognized as one of the country's top First Amendment scholars, as was mentioned here, he's well known for advocating a liberty theory of free speech in place of the classic marketplace of ideas rationale for free speech that's long dominated First Amendment case law. He discussed this in his 1989 book, Human Liberty and Freedom of Speech. So the classic marketplace of ideas theory argues that the truth can be discovered through robust debate free from governmental interference. The central idea of this theory is that if you have two opinions, their open discussion and debate provides the best means to discover the truth. And the truth will then lead to better decisions and better outcomes. Therefore, Professor Baker observed that under the marketplace of ideas theory, the value of free speech lies in the societal benefits derived from unimpeded discussion. Professor Baker explained that the classic marketplace of ideas theory has its critics, including critiques of its underlying assumptions. Critics ask, well, is truth really objective? And are people rational enough to discover the truth and to choose the best ideas from an open debate? And critics also point out, as he said, that failures of the marketplace of ideas, such as concentrated control of the media, a lack of access to the marketplace of ideas by marginalized groups, and the influence of propaganda, disinformation, and behavior manipulation. And he discussed these failures of the marketplace of ideas in his 1989 book. So you can just imagine what he would say now, with fake news, fake videos, AI, social media, and the like. So because of many of these criticisms and what he perceived as the faulty assumptions, Professor Baker believed that the classic marketplace of ideas theory is ultimately unworkable as a theory of the First Amendment, although he thought the marketplace of ideas was definitely aspirational, and he absolutely appreciated the value of a debate and the availability, the necessity of a wide diversity of opinions. And so instead of the marketplace of ideas theory, Professor Baker argued for the liberty theory of free speech. Under this theory, he said, speech is protected not because it's a means to achieve a collective good, but because of its value to the individual, and because it fosters individual self-realization and self-determination. He explained that the liberty theory of free speech supports the protection of a broad realm of nonviolent, non-coercive expression, including speech and expressive activity. So he viewed freedom of speech and freedom of the press as two independent concepts in the First Amendment, supported by two different theories. While Professor Baker applied the liberty theory to the free speech clause, believing freedom of speech to be fundamentally about individual liberty, he subscribed to the traditional Fourth Estate rationale for freedom of the press. He viewed the press metaphorically as, a fourth institution that serves as a check on the three official branches of the U.S. government. And under that Fourth Estate rationale, the press requires special protection, more than other commercial enterprises. It requires special protection because of its essential contribution to a healthy democracy and a free society. And accordingly, Professor Baker emphasized the need for strong protections against governmental threats to the freedom of the press. So after looking at the theories behind free speech and freedom of the press, and the protections needed from governmental restrictions on the press, Professor Baker then turned to threats to a free press from private powers. And in particularly, he looked at threats from advertising and threats from the concentration of media ownership. In his book, Advertising and a Democratic Press, he argued that the press's dependence on advertising can undermine the press performance and minimize press contributions to a free and democratic society. He believed that advertisers act as censors of media content, skewing content in favor of the content that they like. So he argued that advertising can even cause media to limit important content, such as content that might offend, coverage about defective products or coverage of a war. They might limit that content because it might offend advertisers, or because advertisers won't support content that doesn't put consumers in a buying mood. He also recognized that there were strong, news organizations that made sure that that worked very hard not to be influenced by advertisers. But he thought this was a systemic issue. And Professor Baker did believe that advertising can provide useful information to consumers, for sure, and he understood that advertising supports a lot of non-advertising content. But he suggested some policy fixes, including taxes on advertising and subsidies to the press, to help reduce some of those systemic censoring effects of advertising. So in his 2007 book, Media Concentration and Democracy, Why Ownership Matters, Professor Baker moved to an analysis of media ownership. He expressed grave concerns about the increasing concentration of media ownership and the resulting loss of local news outlets and the damage that this can cause to our democracy. He was reacting in part to media deregulation that had started in the 1990s and the relaxation of ownership rules that had previously had a greater limit on the number of broadcast outlets that a single entity could own. He explained that it was important to have the widest practical distribution of media power in order to provide safeguards for our democratic system. He explained that a wide distribution of media ownership limits the risk that a single outlet can abuse their power and choose and control the government. Extreme, but he called that the Berlusconi effect, if you're aware of Italian politics. And wider distribution of media ownership increases the likelihood of having multiple media decision makers who will devote resources to their media watchdog roles. So in 2009, Professor Baker testified before Congress, and he expressed his concerns about the diminishing diversity of media ownership and the reduction of journalism in local markets. telling Congress that that recent spate of layoffs of journalists and the closure of daily news outlets was a real big crisis of the time in the news industry and a real threat to democracy. And he said that recent corporate combinations in the news industry had merely served as an excuse to lay off more journalists in order to earn more revenue. And he explained that the market alone can't be expected to support professional quality journalism, since everyone benefits from the work of journalists who expose corruption and assure that governments and corporations and institutions are accountable. He said everyone benefits whether or not they're customers of that particular media. And everyone benefits from the wiser voting that comes from, educated voters. And he also pointed out that the country's founders had recognized that the media market was inadequate. They did that by enacting the free press clause in the Bill of Rights, and they also gave subsidies to the press from the beginning, especially in the form of postal subsidies. He pointed out to Congress that in the early 20th century, Congress gave an annual postal subsidy to newspapers of $80 million, which he estimated to be worth $6 billion in 2009 if calculated on a per-person basis. And so since the market doesn't provide media companies with sufficient revenue to match the value that they provide, Professor Baker urged a public policy response. And his proposal to Congress was to give media companies tax credits for each journalist, for the half of the salary for each journalist that they employed up to $45,000 a year. And as a side note, I'd point out that this proposal has gotten some traction, hasn't been passed, but a bipartisan Local Journalism Sustainability Act was introduced in 2020 and 2021 with a somewhat smaller tax credit for journalists. It wasn't adopted, but it was proposed, and I understand there may be efforts to propose it again. So Professor Baker's alarm over the state of the media landscape rings even louder, much louder today than it did when he testified before Congress in 2009, as the trends that he observed in local newspaper closures and journalist layoffs have continued and accelerated. According to a GAO study, the Government Accountability Office, the study was released in January of this year, and they said that more than 2,000 local newspapers have closed since the early 2000s. Many more have cut back on their operations. And one study cited by the GAO found that at least 1,800 communities that had a local newspaper in 2004 did not have one in 2020 and were now considered local news deserts. So, meanwhile, according to the GAO study, based on research from the Pew Research Center and Department of Labor, hopefully you can see that, the number of newsroom employees at newspaper publishers declined from about 71,000 to about 31,000 between 2008 and 2020. And in the same time frame, the number of newsroom employees at digital-only operations increased from 7,000 to about 18,000. But that's an overall reduction of 29,000 journalists, or 30% of journalists in 12 years. And that was in 2020. And since then, we've had a pandemic, and the advertising market has gone down. And I don't have the exact numbers, but it feels like that these trends have definitely continued. If you look at the trends starting in 2000, as this slide shows, you can see how journalist employment really dropped off steeply starting in 2008 when there was a 2008 economic downturn. Now, according to Nancy Gibbs of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, newspapers were once a $100 billion business in America. That figure has shrunk to just $17 billion today, she estimated. So this is a problem. There have been some, changes that have replaced traditional news outlets, their digital sources of news and social media, but it hasn't been enough to close the gap and perform the fourth estate function that is needed in local communities. So as the New York Times succinctly put it, without an independent local news source, residents don't have the information they need to make informed decisions about civic issues and governance, and that provides an opening for the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And experts cited by the GAO also opined that without local journalism to hold public officials and institutions accountable, and without journalism's oversight function, there's greater potential for corruption. So, as bad as the news is for local news and our democracy, there is some cause for hope. First of all, there's wider and wider recognition of a crisis, and that's recognition is always a first step. From the GAO report to numerous studies and op-eds, institutions and governments and scholars have expressed serious concerns about the state of local news and its impact on American democracy. Second, the cause for hope is that there are organizations that are now putting significant, potentially transformative amounts of money to support local news and information and strengthen democracy. So just last month, 22 major donors, led by the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation, announced that they would join forces through an initiative called Press Forward to donate over $500 million over the next 5 years to support local news. And they hope to increase that amount and to add more donors to the effort. Press Forward announced the following priorities for its funding: strengthening existing local newsrooms, building shared services and tools ranging from legal support to membership tools, closing inequalities to journalism coverage, and advancing public policies that expand access to local news. So in addition to this remarkable collaborative funding, policy recommendations are emerging to support local media, including federal and state legislation to encourage the hiring of journalists, and efforts by cities to make sure they spend a good chunk of their own advertising funds on nonprofit media and local, small community news operations. So, as the philanthropic community considers how best to support local news and strengthen democracy, local nonprofit media organizations, in particular those that are exempt from taxation under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, provide an excellent model of engagement in local journalism that educates citizens and holds institutions accountable. To be clear, I'm not arguing that nonprofits are the only models that can work. Professor Baker himself said that an ideal media realm will be pluralist in the types of media entities that it supports. There are many terrific examples of for-profit local media. But the loss of local media and its resulting impact of democracy is big and urgent, and it requires commitment and innovation, and we can't rule anything out. But nonetheless, the unique state and federal laws and regulations applicable to nonprofit organizations assure that the resources and revenues of a local nonprofit media organization are used to serve the core charitable and educational mission of the organization, which is to provide news and information. First, there are state laws that require a nonprofit media organization to set out its charitable purposes in its Articles of Incorporation, also known as its charter. And these state laws then require the organization to abide by their charter, and they prohibit the organization from disposing of their assets, whether by sale, assignment, or transfer, to any individual or for any purpose other than the charitable purposes. And if the nonprofit media organization improperly disposes of or uses the assets, the state attorney general can penalize the corporation or even dissolve the entity. Then, second, and very importantly, federal tax laws assure that the local media organization's resources are used to serve its charitable and educational mission. In order to obtain 501c3 status, an organization must be organized for exempt purposes, as set out in its charter. And the organization, of course, must be operated for exempt purposes. They can have an insubstantial part of their activities associated with non-exempt purposes, But if the organization earns income from any regular trade or business that's not substantially related to its charitable purpose, then the organization must pay taxes on its unrelated business income. That's known as UBIT, familiarly. And the income, that UBIT, that has to be used for funding the organization's exempt purposes. And the unrelated business must constitute just an insubstantial part of the whole organization's activities, or else they risk a loss of their tax-exempt status, which is a very big problem, I assure you. The organization's assets must be permanently dedicated to its exempt purposes. So if the organization dissolves, then any assets that are remaining would have to go to the exempt purpose or go to a government, whether federal, state, or local government, for public purposes. And a nonprofit organization may not be organized for the benefit of any private interests, and no part of any net earnings may inure to the benefit of a private shareholder or any individual. So employees can, of course, earn salaries, and a nonprofit may pay reasonable compensation for services, but the organization may not engage in what's called an excess benefit transaction, where an economic benefit is provided to a director or officer or employee in excess of the value that the organization receives. So if an officer is paid a salary that's above fair market value, can't do it. That's considered an excess benefit transaction. Or if the organization pays more than a reasonable amount for services. And if there is an excess benefit transaction, then both the organization and the managers of the organizations who approved that transaction or that payment, they can be fined with an excise tax. So nonprofits, as you can imagine, take great care to make sure that they do not pay more than a reasonable amount for salaries or services, so that their assets can be used, the bulk of their assets can be used for their exempt purposes. Another thing that helps, sort of direct local nonprofit media to assure that they use their assets for charitable and exempt purposes also involves fiduciary duties of the nonprofit media organization's directors. A nonprofit director has multiple fiduciary duties to the organization that it serves on the board, and they generally have a fiduciary duty of obedience to the nonprofit corporation, which means that the director has a duty to be faithful to the mission and charter of the organization. In other words, they have a duty to be faithful to the educational and informational purposes for which the nonprofit was organized. On the other hand, directors of for-profit corporations have many fiduciary duties, of course, but their duties are to both the company and to the shareholders. And the shareholder part, that does not enter the equation for nonprofits. So fourth, there are other restrictions there are restrictions on advertising and sponsorship by nonprofits, and they further require nonprofit media organizations to focus on their charitable purposes. And this is a whole separate specialty for some attorneys. I'll try to keep it simple. Nonprofit radio and TV stations, they are prohibited from airing promotional and announcements on behalf of for-profit entities in exchange for consideration. They're permitted to broadcast acknowledgments of contributions, and in fact, they're required to identify their contributors, but those acknowledgments are restricted in what they say, and they can't interrupt regularly scheduled programming. So in some, there are no ads, there are no infomercials, and there's no product placement on local broadcast media, nonprofit educational broadcast media. And other than the brief acknowledgments of contributions, the nonprofit's broadcast space must be dedicated to its charitable and educational purposes. And not all nonprofit media companies, whether or not they're broadcast, print, digital, they're subject to IRS rules, which are pretty similar. And they also, they may allow advertising, but it's subject to UBIT, unrelated business income, and it has to be minimal, as I discussed earlier. And they'll be charged taxes on it. And they can also offer qualified sponsorships, but those are very limited in what they can say. And then in addition to these other things, there are many other restrictions on the activities of nonprofit corporations that require them to focus on their charitable education purposes. So there are often grant restrictions. If a nonprofit receives a grant from a foundation or big donor, they're going to put some restrictions that really make sure that their money is being used for the purposes that they want. If a nonprofit gets tax-exempt, bond funding to help build a facility, there are a lot of restrictions on that. So say a nonprofit builds a beautiful building and they want to use one of the rooms to rent it out, on the weekends for parties or whatever. They have to be very careful about limiting the commercial use of the facilities, or else they might lose their tax-exempt bond funding. There's a lot more detail of that, which I won't get into. But then another restriction on local nonprofit media companies is found in the really high expectations of their audience members, their readers. It's not a legal requirement, but it's often just as important. The audience members and small donors that support local nonprofit media organizations, they expect more from nonprofits than they do from many of their commercial counterparts, whether it's in hard news, sticking to their mission, or being more ethical. So there are lots of examples of local nonprofit media providing unique and tremendous service to their local communities, from public broadcast stations to statewide digital news networks to nonprofits focused on minority communities. And there are also many wonderful examples of national nonprofit media organizations, but those are outside of the purview of my talk today. In public broadcasting is the area that I know well from my career. Public broadcasters around the country have been doing an exceptional job providing local news and cultural programming and service to their communities, and they would do more if they had more funding. Public radio and TV stations are all independent organizations. They're supported by the communities they serve, and they collectively cover more than 98% of the U.S. population with free programming and services. Public media stations are owned by local community organizations, by local universities, and as in the case of West Virginia, by the state or local networks. And they're guided by their mission to provide educational and informational programming, educational content to school children, public safety information to their communities. And although not required, many local public media stations are members of the broader public radio or television networks, and through which they have access to some shared services, shared tools, journalism training, things like that to help them provide even better service to their local communities. In West Virginia, I mentioned it, West Virginia Public Broadcasting is a state network, but it also has two nonprofit organizations that help support their work. Each year, as an example of their public service, each year during your 60-day West Virginia legislative session, West Virginia Public Broadcasting has a simulcast TV and radio program every night at 6. It also provides regular news updates throughout the day, and they have a second TV channel and a digital stream where you can hear live gavel-to-gavel coverage of what the West Virginia legislature is doing. There are a lot of statewide networks, a number of them that have been coming on the scene in the last 10 to 15 years. The Texas Tribune is sort of a beacon or an example for many nonprofits. They launched in 2009 as a member-supported, digital-first nonprofit media organization that informs Texans about public policy and politics and government statewide issues. Vermont Digger is a statewide effort to produce rigorous journalism. They started in 2009 to focus on state politics, and they've expanded from there. And they now have the largest newsroom in the state of Vermont. I pay attention to them because my son went to college in Vermont until this year, and they did just an amazing job when they had the historic flooding last summer, and they still continue to do it. They continue to cover up issues like cleanup efforts and disaster funding and how to get it, things that continue to be really important to Vermonters. And in your own state, I've been just so impressed with the options, the local media that's out there. There's the nonprofit Mountain State Spotlight is a nonprofit investigative newsroom and digital media provider that started in 2020. And it has a mission to improve the state by producing what it calls sustained outrage journalism that exposes abuses of power by government, businesses, and institutions. And I was just introduced to another great news service in West Virginia called West Virginia Watch. It aims to fill the gaps that are left by shrinking newsrooms elsewhere. And there's just great story coverage focused on healthcare and in the environment and government and education. And it's an interesting model. It seems it's unique to West Virginia, but then it's part of a broader group called the States Newsroom, which provides some shared services and tools so the small group they have here can focus on the news. There are nonprofits focused on minority communities. I saw last week in Capital B, Atlanta, which is a nonprofit news organization dedicated to publishing need-to-know information, civic journalism, and accountability reporting, informed by listening and engagement with Black Atlanta Metro residents. And as local commercial media have struggled, there have been some local commercial newspapers acquired by nonprofits. And most recently, this year, a nonprofit called the National Trust for Nonprofit News purchased the Portland Press Herald in Maine, as well as 4 other daily newspapers and 17 weekly newspapers in Maine, with guiding principles of editorial independence and public accountability. So there are lots of terrific examples of local nonprofit media providing excellent service to their communities. However, local news coverage is not easy and it's not cheap. And it's going to take a lot of creativity and funding to make up for the enormous decline that I discussed earlier in local media that's happened over the last 2 decades. But this effort is really critical to our democracy. We need solid journalism about local government and institutions so that people become more engaged in their communities and are guided by facts rather than misinformation. So as citizens of your communities, you can help by supporting your local nonprofit media. I mean, first you can support your local nonprofit media by just reading it and listening to it. Learn about local issues and vote and participate in your community. And if you're able, or when you're able, become a member of your local nonprofit media organizations. It needn't cost a lot, and every membership means a lot to these organizations. And encourage local businesses to sponsor local nonprofit media, and encourage governments to support local nonprofit, whether through funding, advertising campaigns, tax incentives, or other policies. And as law students and lawyers, you can do so much to support local media and local nonprofit media. I mean, local nonprofit media can use your skills, whether it's to help set up nonprofit organizations, or to provide nonprofit governance and tax advice, or to help with contract and real estate matters, to help with copyright and trademark issues. They have them every day. And employment matters, to help protect local journalists from government restrictions or subpoenas. And local journalists also can use help with their investigative reporting from lawyers, particularly in making federal or state Freedom of Information Act, FOIA requests, and then also helping to fight back if the government improperly rejects requests for information under FOIA. So there's so much you can do as lawyers and citizens. And our democracy depends on your support. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, let me know.
and see who has questions. I mean, I have one to get started, but I don't want to steal time. So.
Hi. In your opinion, is the social media news, is that helping or hurting local news, in your opinion?
Oh, it depends. I mean, social media is just part of news, and every news organization has social media, engages in social media, and is using it as a way to reach people. So I think it's a reality, and it's just for news organizations, it's another tool to provide information and hopefully enable people to find out more and dig deeper. But there is there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make sure that the information coming from social media and all of these other things are real, and that's that can hurt a lot. I heard a crazy statistic about how much of the information that is being sifted through by the major news organizations about the recent war in the Middle East, how much is fake news compared to real, and a lot is not real or it's out of context. But that's where journalism organizations come in, because they will look at it all and then provide that context and help figure out what is reliable. So, little both.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for being with us today. This has been fantastic. I kind of want to follow up on Kennedy's question to a degree. With the proliferation of social media, I mean, with a phone in my pocket, I have audio recorder, I have a video recorder. Like, I can type, I can tweet. I have my own forum to be like my own journalist if I want. So, like, as much as this is as much as it's of critical importance to make sure that there is, free, unbiased media out there, media organizations like the news that we all grew up on, and in a lot of ways wish it was still that way. How much does it weigh now? Like, how much of it is also an undercurrent where there's a need almost to like not just train the the journalistic organizations, but also like just training citizens of, you have this power yourself, you need to use it properly. Like, there's a responsibility that comes with what you put out.
Oh, yeah, there's a responsibility that comes with what you put out. There's a responsibility in sort of, media education, understanding media and the sources that you're receiving your information so you can judge what you're getting. But I agree. I mean, that sounds like a great effort.
You were mentioning earlier about a lot of the fake news coming from overseas, and I'm not sure how to phrase this, but what I'm thinking about is there's a lot of pressure for like a breaking news cycle and to get things out first, and balancing that with fact checking. And I feel like there's perhaps unique challenges for this on like a local nonprofit level. And again, I'm not quite sure what to ask, but I'm hoping if there might be some insight into how to address those issues, maybe some best practices, et cetera.
Whew. I mean, it is a constant tension for journalists to get information out quickly and to get it out correctly. And, that's why there are news organizations with editors and, different layers to make sure that they're getting out correct information. A lot of news organizations would tell you it's most important to get it out correctly. But it's a balance, and some some of the smaller local nonprofits are focusing on longer term stories rather than breaking news, so that they have the ability to step back and make sure that they're getting it right. And the organizations focusing on breaking news are also working very hard to get it right, and they have more resources to put in that. But it takes more resources to do that.
Our resident nonprofit expert. Sorry.
Oh,
So one thing that people may not know that wasn't on your slide is that nonprofits are subject to what's called the Johnson Amendment, which is a provision of 501c3 that says that nonprofits cannot get involved in political campaigns. So I would imagine, so for-profit media can do endorsements, but local media can't, or nonprofit media can't for that reason. There's been a push on the Hill to get rid of the Johnson Amendment in full, or even in part only for churches, and I was wondering how that would affect nonprofit media. Would they be in favor of having the ability to go ahead and do endorsements, or are they happy to have limitations so they can stay out of the fray?
oh, that's interesting. I haven't studied that in particular. I know that the organization that I worked for doesn't, they stay out of that. They don't, they don't want to make endorsements. They just, want to provide the facts and stay out of politics. But that's a really interesting question. So I would say stay out of the fray.
Can you say something about Sinclair Media Group? And I know you're talking about local nonprofits, but the kind of major public shareholder company that's sort of buying up local media, and from a viewer perspective, it looks like you're still watching the same local media that you were, but it's actually owned by like for-profit shareholder-driven media. And I don't know, I mean, it seems like a real threat to what you're presenting, but.
I mean, I think there are places for all different types of media. So I was focusing on local nonprofits because that's what I know, and that's what I think that they do an excellent job. But I think there's place for all kinds of nonprofits. I mean, you have excellent news sources of for-profit news sources in this state. I'm thinking of the all the work on the opioid crisis is amazing. So I think there are places for different types of media, and I'm focusing on nonprofit media. But I don't know the specifics of Sinclair.
I'm just going to follow up a little bit on that because, when Ed wrote about concentration of media, it seems that he would have been concerned about a model like Sinclair, where there's a concentration of one owner of all these local news organizations. And so you think you're getting local news, but you're really getting a script, at least. I'll take out Sinclair because we'll just keep it generic. But there are some companies, very few, that are buying up local news agencies or local news, and then they script the same thing to everyone. So instead of putting you in a bad position to talk about that from the nonprofit, what do you think Ed would say about something like that?
Right.
Okay.
Ed was very concerned about that. He was raising the alarm in the 1990s and early 2000s, and things keep changing, and there's a lot fewer media owners out there than there were even back when he passed away in 2009. So he would be concerned about that. His argument is that it is better to have more people looking at the news from different perspectives. The more perspectives you have, the better. So.
We have time for one more. Yeah? Did I skip somebody? Okay, two. Okay. Sure. No, we're
Okay. This was really interesting. My sister is actually a local journalist in West Virginia, and we were just discussing kind of the importance of like local media coverage. She's found that like West Virginians are very engaged in their local communities from hundreds of comments on Facebook stories and things like that. But obviously that's not the case everywhere. How have you seen kind of local nonprofit media outlets engaging with their communities to increase viewership or bring people to their sources instead of focusing on kind of that national news that typically people are more aware of?
Mhm. I mean, local news, they just need to get to know their communities. It helps if they're from their communities and they know the communities well. There's so much going on, and there's so much more digging to be done, and so I just think there's lots more to be done, but good for her.
Thank you. Over the summer, we saw a local newspaper in Kansas be rated by their local government. They had been engaged in that long-term investigative journalism you spoke
Oh,
of
yes.
against corruption, and the people they were investigating turned the tables and raided the station and took their computers. Ultimately, how do local nonprofit organizations defend themselves against that? What we saw in Kansas obviously was extreme, but I'm sure some smaller versions of that are happening every day. What do we do as institutions to help them, and what do they do to help themselves?
Right. Well, that was extreme, very, very extreme. The local, they need lawyers like you all to protect them and help them, do what they need to do. I mean, that was a terrible example, and hopefully it doesn't happen too much more. But yeah, they need lawyers to help, protect the news organizations and let them do the work that they need to do for their communities. It's really important to have local news, locally operated, locally controlled news, because they really understand and they understand their communities and they have accountability to their communities. So all that you can do to support it, please support your local news.
Okay, let's do one more round of applause. Thank you. I know folks have class. I think there's some extra food, so please grab as you go, and I think you can stay around a few minutes to
Sure.
answer any more questions. Okay, all right, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Oh, thank you.